The rains failed quietly at first. Across the Deccan Plateau in the early 1630s, farmers waited for the monsoon that had guided their lives for generations. Fields were prepared, seeds were sown, and the sky remained empty. Weeks passed. Rivers thinned. Wells dropped lower each day. What began as an uneasy delay soon spread into a crisis that stretched across western India. Crops withered across Gujarat, the Deccan, and parts of the Mobile frontier. Trade faltered, grain prices soared, and entire communities found themselves facing a reality that few had imagined possible: the land that had sustained millions could no longer feed them. The famine that unfolded between 1630 and 1632 is remembered as one of the most severe food crises in early modern South Asian history. Historians often refer to it as the Great Deccan Famine. Contemporary records from Mobile administrators, travelers, and regional chroniclers describe widespread crop failure, social disruption, and large-scale mortality. While exact figures remain uncertain, many historians estimate that millions of people across the region died during these years. To understand how the famine developed, it is necessary to look at the conditions that existed before the crisis began. The early 17th century was a period of expansion and consolidation for the Mughal Empire under Emperor Shah Jahan. Mughal authority had steadily pushed southward from northern India into the Deccan Plateau, an area that had long been contested by several regional sultanates, including Ahmadnagar, Bijapur, and Golconda. Military campaigns in the region had intensified during the late 1620s and early 1630s as the empire sought to secure political dominance and control over valuable agricultural territories. War itself did not create the famine, but it weakened the stability of the regions that would soon be affected. Armies moved through farmland, supplies were requisitioned from local communities, and many rural areas experienced disruption to normal agricultural cycles. At the same time, taxation remained an essential part of imperial governance. Mobile revenue systems relied heavily on agricultural production, and land taxes were often assessed based on expected yields rather than the realities of a difficult season. In ordinary years, the Deccan Plateau supported dense agricultural networks. Farmers relied on the summer monsoon, which typically arrived between June and September. Seasonal rains replenished soil moisture, filled reservoirs, and sustained crops such as millet, wheat, pulses, and cotton. A single failed monsoon could create hardship, but communities had developed coping mechanisms, including grain storage, regional trade, and migration to areas where harvests remained stable. The crisis of 1630 began when the monsoon failed across large sections of western India. Drought conditions affected Gujarat, Khandesh, the Deccan Plateau, and surrounding regions. With little rainfall, crops could not mature. Harvests that farmers depended on simply did not arrive. The failure of one harvest was severe enough. The failure of multiple harvest cycles proved devastating. As the drought continued, food supplies declined rapidly. Grain merchants began holding back stocks, anticipating further shortages. Prices rose dramatically. Contemporary records suggest that the cost of staple grains increased many times over within a short period. What had once been accessible to ordinary laborers and farmers became unattainable for many families. The impact spread through every level of society. Rural communities were the first to experience the effects. Farmers who had lost their crops could no longer pay land taxes or maintain their households. Many sold livestock, tools, and household goods in exchange for small amounts of grain. As conditions worsened, families began migrating toward towns and trade centers in the hope that food might still be available there. Cities soon faced their own pressures. Urban markets were supplied by the surrounding countryside, and when those supplies collapsed, city populations were forced to compete for increasingly limited resources. Grain shipments that might once have traveled across regional trade routes were interrupted by both drought conditions and the instability created by ongoing military activity. Travelers who passed through the region during these years left descriptions that historians still study today. Some wrote of abandoned villages and roads crowded with people searching for food. Others described markets where grain was sold in extremely small quantities at prices far beyond the reach of ordinary workers. The Mughal administration was not unaware of the crisis. Imperial officials recorded the rising grain prices and the severe conditions affecting rural districts. Emperor Shah Jahan ordered certain relief measures, including the distribution of food in some areas and temporary reductions in land taxes. Charitable kitchens were established in a number of cities where the poor could receive basic meals. These measures, however, faced significant limitations. The geographic scale of the famine was vast, stretching across multiple provinces and regions that were not always easy to administer or supply. Transportation infrastructure in the 17th century depended largely on animal caravans and river routes. Moving large quantities of grain into drought-stricken areas required time, security, and available surplus from other regions. In many places, there simply was not enough grain available to stabilize prices or feed the growing numbers of displaced people. Relief efforts helped some communities, but they could not fully counteract the combined pressures of drought, war, and disrupted agriculture. The second year of the crisis proved even more difficult than the first. When the next monsoon season approached, farmers hoped that the rains would finally return and allow them to plant new crops. In some areas, rainfall remained irregular or insufficient, prolonging the agricultural collapse. Even where rain eventually arrived, many farmers had already lost seed supplies, livestock, and the labor capacity needed to restart cultivation. The consequences extended beyond immediate hunger. Agricultural systems depend on continuity, seeds, draft animals, tools, and experienced laborers. When famine breaks these systems, recovery becomes slow and uncertain. Merchants and local officials struggled to maintain order as desperation grew. Trade routes were disrupted not only by environmental conditions but also by population movement. Entire families traveled across the countryside searching for work, food, or safer conditions in regions that had been less affected by the drought. In Gujarat, one of the regions hardest hit by the famine, commercial activity slowed dramatically. Ports that had previously handled significant trade with the Persian Gulf and the wider Indian Ocean saw declining shipments of agricultural goods. Local markets shrank as purchasing power disappeared among the population. The famine also reshaped demographic patterns across the Deccan. Many villages lost a large portion of their inhabitants. Some settlements were temporarily abandoned, while others saw long-term population decline. When rains eventually returned and agriculture began to recover, the labor force in certain areas had been significantly reduced. Religious institutions and local charitable networks played an important role during the crisis. Temples, mosques, and community organizations often provided food assistance when possible, using donations and stored grain. These efforts varied widely depending on the resources available in each region, but they formed an important part of local survival strategies. Despite these efforts, mortality remained high. Contemporary writers often describe the famine in stark terms, emphasizing the scale of suffering that unfolded across the countryside. While the precise number of deaths cannot be determined with certainty, many historical studies estimate that the combined effects of drought, starvation, and related diseases may have led to the deaths of millions across western and central India. By 1632, the environmental conditions that had triggered the crisis began to shift. The monsoon returned with greater reliability, allowing agricultural production to slowly resume. Farmers who remained in the region began planting again, and trade networks gradually reopened as new harvests entered local markets. Recovery, however, was uneven. Fields that had been left uncultivated required time to restore. Livestock herds had been reduced during the famine, and replacing draft animals necessary for plowing took several years. Grain reserves had been exhausted, leaving many communities vulnerable to even small disruptions during the early stages of recovery. The Mughal administration also faced the challenge of rebuilding revenue systems that had been severely weakened by the famine. Agricultural taxes formed a major source of imperial income, and widespread crop failure meant that provincial officials collected far less revenue during the crisis years. In response, certain regions received temporary tax adjustments or administrative reforms aimed at stabilizing agricultural production. The famine also influenced political developments in the Deccan. The weakening of local economies and the movement of populations contributed to shifting power dynamics among regional states and local leaders. In the decades that followed, the Deccan would continue to be an area of political transformation, eventually becoming central to the rise of new regional powers, including the Marathas. For historians, the Great Deccan Famine illustrates how environmental events can interact with political structures, economic systems, and social conditions. Drought alone did not determine the scale of the disaster. The vulnerability of agricultural communities, the pressures of imperial taxation, the disruptions caused by warfare, and the limits of early modern transportation and relief systems all played roles in shaping the outcome. It also serves as a reminder of how dependent pre-industrial societies were on seasonal climate patterns. In a world without modern irrigation networks, global food markets, or rapid transportation, a failed monsoon could cascade into a crisis affecting millions of people. Today, the famine of 1630 to 1632 remains an important subject of historical research. Scholars study it through administrative records, travel accounts, local chronicles, and environmental reconstructions. Each source adds detail to the broader picture of how one environmental disruption spread across a vast region and reshaped communities for years afterward. The fields of the Deccan eventually returned to cultivation. Markets reopened, caravans resumed their journeys, and new harvests filled storage granaries once again. Yet the memory of those difficult years remained in regional histories and imperial records. The famine revealed both the resilience of local societies and the limits of early modern states when confronted with environmental catastrophe on a massive scale. In the quiet return of the monsoon rains after years of absence, the land began to recover. But the famine had already altered the lives of millions, leaving behind a historical reminder of how fragile stability could be when climate, politics, and human survival collided across an entire region.